Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marina Chang. I am working at Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University. Thank you, everybody, coming to this section, and many thanks to ORFC team to organize this conference and this particular section. And thanks for our volunteers for technical support. I would like to give special thanks to two ladies behind the scene, Ruth and Frank at ORFC, who suggested this section in the first place back in September last year, after receiving very positive feedback from the participants of a Heritage Grant workshop at the ORFC Weeklings event. Thank you very much for that. It is a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce our two speakers today, Chang and Colin Tudge. Chang will be the main speaker of this section, focusing on his restorative continuous grain cropping using heritage grains. I think it's fair to say that Chang is the creator of heritage grain sector in the UK. Well, I let him speak for himself why he is the creator of this sector. In my view, the core to Chang's innovation is his ability to integrate different kinds of knowledge, including environmental science, archaeobotany, history, genetics, and agronomy, and also his practical skills in crop development, farming, thatching, milling, and baking, and now even crop malting for beer. Not only in the UK, Chang's work is gaining momentum with the global agroecology movement and showing some impact on the development of heritage grain sector in Europe, United States, Canada, Latin America, China, and Taiwan, where I'm originally from. However, before Chang speaks, I would like to introduce Colin Tudge. Colin is the co-founder of ORFC, as you know. He has written many books and articles on natural history, evolution, food and farming, and more recently on the philosophy of science and metaphysics. I have always been impressed and inspired by Colin and his work ever since I met him the first time at the Royal Society in London when I was a PhD student, where he had a lively debate with a GM advocate in 2008. More importantly, he was one of the major inspirations during my PhD study at UCL. And in fact, he's still an inspirational thinker and writer for me personally, and for many others, I believe. Colin is definitely the best person to contextualize the significance and the relevance of Chang's work in terms of food and farming transformation towards agroecology and food sovereignty. He will also tell us why he thinks Chang's work invite all of us for a paradigm shift for food and farming in the 21st century. Please join me to welcome Colin to give us a more proper introduction to Chang's speech. Thanks, Colin.
You want me to start? Hello, thank you. I reckon that it is the case that heritage grain, combined with the whole idea of population breeding, is one of a key component of a very short list of key components of agroecology. And the whole idea of agroecology is that you treat farms as ecosystems, as Bex Hoskin likes to say, treat them as closed systems with leaky borders so that they are, in fact, communicating with the outside world. And agroecology, together with food sovereignty, are the two prime components of this way of farming, which we're calling real farming. I like to call it enlightened agriculture. The other prime ingredients of real farming are, for example, pasture feeding, agroecology, agroforestry rather, and permaculture, and various others, but these I see as the main ones. But The one that doesn't often get mentioned in this context is the one we're going to hear about today, combination of heritage grains with the idea of population breeding. And I reckon this could be the most important component of agroecology of them all. And given that agroecology, I would suggest, is the way forward for all of agriculture, then I suggest that what we're going to hear about today from John is one of the most important interventions of our time, which I think in the long term will prove to be of more importance than GM and all the other stuff that is currently so fashionable and is currently attracting, or might well attract, more Nobel Prizes and so on and so on. It is of key importance because to me it's one of the first real attempts, big attempts, to bring arable farming into the realms of agroecology. And the reason that's so important is, of course, that arable is actually, in practice, the most important of all agricultural enterprises, because we get more than half our calories from cereals, and we get more than half our protein from cereals, surprisingly. And arable farming takes up the most room of all the forms, apart from grazing, of all the cultivated forms of farming. And it is also, in its present form, its present industrial form, extremely hostile to wildlife. And therefore, for that reason alone, and for the fact that it's totally oil dependent, it is very, very obviously not sustainable. And the more we pursue go down the track of industrial arable, the more we will work ourselves into a corner. Now, John's work, I think, together with a few other people, but John is one of the pioneers, I think is the most plausible way out of this cul-de-sac. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say. Thank you.
Thanks for calling your introduction. Let us welcome John Letts, the creator and the pioneer of heritage grain sector in the UK and the founder of Heritage Harvest Limited, to inspire us with his restorative continuous grain cropping using heritage grain. Floor is yours, John.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Colin. I have no idea how I'm going to live up to that introduction, but I'd like to just sit back and hear more because it's so warming to me. Thank you for the really kind words. Both Colin and Marina have been a great inspiration to me. I mean, Colin, I've been following Colin's work and reading his immense number of books. Every topic that comes up, Colin's written a book on. So to have those words coming from someone who's been my hero since the early 1980s is really wonderful. And Marina has been inspiring me for 5-6 years. We've been working together now. Her kind of a community approach is wonderful. Her work on food security. And also this idea that she has constantly about looking at how the progress we make in agroecology, heritage grains, artisan baking, all of that, how there's always a social justice component in that, so that the benefits of what we're doing isn't just for the elites who can afford a lovely sourdough loaf, but that we have to get everyone. So thank you immensely, and I'll try to live up to that introduction, but I want to just say one thing from the very start. And I'm sorry, I've been a bit jet lagged, and I don't think it's COVID, but I haven't been feeling great. I've been abroad for a while. I'm a little bit exhausted, so please bear with me if I lose my spot. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm going to talk about grain, but I just want to make it very clear. I've listened to a lot of talks and in previous years, and I think we have to remember that ORFC has now become very, very international. And I want to be very clear that the little part of the agroecology world that I know about is grain, but grain in the UK. And I just want to clarify that. So the context of what I'm talking about, what I'll talk about today, is just very UK focused. So whether we're talking about seeds or the history of how agriculture has developed and the economic and environmental situation in the UK is just very, very different. I just think that's something that we sometimes miss because we've become such an international conference, and it's not a one-size-fits-all situation here. So if it doesn't fit in your perspective, in your country, whoever is listening, then, well, as I say, I'm talking about what happens in the UK. But I think there is one thing that unites all of us around the world who are involved with grain, and I'm very much speaking here about grain when I talk about organic and conventional. And that is, I think there's been a failure in plant breeding, particularly, and I'll probably lose a few friends at the end of this talk with the people I'm knocking heads. But I speak as someone who's been in plant breeding and as someone who's been an organic farmer. But I think we're grown up enough to be self-critical. And as an old Greek philosopher said, the only thing permanent is change. And I think it's change we need within the organic sector, and certainly within plant breeding. We need a paradigm shift, as I would call it, a massive change of perspective in how we grow our grain crops and how we develop crops for those new agroecological production systems. And my view on that is that we have to move towards very low input production systems. And everything we've done in plant breeding and agriculture has been focused on high input, high nitrogen, high yield, and eliminating natural ecosystems, replacing them with high input systems. And I think we have to use science and history and archaeology and all the fields of knowledge that we can to recreate, in a sense, what our ancestors did. And they lived far closer to natural ecosystems, but manipulate them in a way that is sustainable. I know I'm talking to the converted here, and you all share that general view, but I just thought it was important. That's the focus of my talk, is that we need low input production systems, and we need to create crops that are adapted to those low input production systems. So I'm just going to skirt through. There's really 4 sections. I want to have a quick bash at conventional farming, but that's not going to take long, and I think everyone will follow me on that one. Then I'm going to focus a little bit on organic production, why I think for grain there are problems in organic. And then I'll move on to what I'm calling a restorative continuous grain cropping. I have different acronyms I've used, but basically growing grain every year in the same field, and how that's possible. And I use the term restorative just because I think there's a lot of words out there. People use regenerative and sustainable, and I like the word sustainable personally. I think it does mean a lot. Regenerative I have a few problems with, because I think it could be a catch-all for just about anything. It should mean something, and it could mean something, but it doesn't always mean what we want it to mean. And agroecological is just too big of a mouthful right now, given my mental state of tiredness and everything else. And anyway, my last section, then I'll come on to heritage grains. How I define heritage grains, there's a lot of different perspectives on that, and there's a lot of terminology that people bandy about, like land races and populations and heritage varieties and ancient grains. And I think that confusion is causing problems, because I think, well, united we stand, divided we fall. And I think if we're going to change the way we grow cereal crops, we have to be talking the same language. And part of that confusion, I think, is built into perhaps an unclear understanding of things like genetics and crop evolution. And having Colin on board, who's been communicating science to people for 40 years, is wonderful. And I feel I've in a sense failed in that, and I hope to do better in the next few years as I reorient what I'm going to do away from kind of experimental trials and growing and proving what I think works, and writing more about it and trying to be clearer about it. And that's only my introduction. So Marina, you're going to have to make sure I get through this in the next 40 minutes. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I've never done this in front of a group of people, but we have had a little practice. So I'm now going to share my screen and show a number of slides, which I hope will come through okay to everyone. And it worked. And I'm so excited that it worked. Let me just try to get this. There we go. Everyone can see that? That's working?
Yes.
Okay, I've had no comments, so, okay. So first, I'm just gonna say a few things about conventional farming, conventional grain production. Again, I'm talking about grain here. So when I make these broad statements about farming, I'm really referring to growing wheat and rye, barley and oats in a British context. I'm not talking about root vegetables or anything else. And that's because that's what I know about. So I would say this is a picture of a research plots at NIAB in Cambridgeshire, which is supposed to be it's a few years old now, but it's a monoculture. You see before you what is considered to be the elite of cereal crops that we should be growing, the product of years and years of amazing plant breeding work, research and hard work by plant breeders dedicated to creating these elite crops. But I'm afraid I think that this type of farming just doesn't work. I mean, 60% of farm income today is subsidy. If 60% of the people of the UK were unemployed, I think we'd have a revolution. And I think that's what we need in agriculture. And they don't work because, as Colin said earlier on, that really what modern grain production is about is eliminating the natural ecosystem, replacing it with one species, and every plant in the field is a clone of that one species, in this case wheat. It's incredibly uniform genetically, and really it's just a biofactory, isn't it? You have sunshine coming in, you have massive amounts of inputs, particularly nitrate fertilizer, or nitrogen fertilizer in various forms, and you eliminate every other species in that field, every weed, anything that interferes with the flow of energy into that plant to produce grain. That's all it is. It's not an agroecosystem, it's just a biological factory, really. And I understand that concept, and plant breeders' job has been to create these varieties in the economic and political context that we have. And I think that's obviously been destroying the soil, destroying biodiversity, destroying the planet. I mean, these plants are miracle plants. They're amazing in the sense of what has been created, but they're kind of, I see them as like Formula One cars. If you put them on a flat track and give them airplane fuel, they'll go really fast, get you around a track. I'm not sure you're going anywhere, but that's what it is. But if you put a Formula One car on a country lane with lots of potholes and put some dirty diesel in the engine, it's not going to go very fast. So to keep this unstable ecological situation going, you need fertilizer. Because everything's uniform, you need fungicides, you need pesticides. Because it's a very sugar rich. These plants, the first thing they do is take sunshine in the presence of massive amounts of nitrogen, that is, create lots of sugar in the plants that builds up, and eventually then as the plant ripens, all that sugar is pushed up to create grain. Well, that sugar is a smorgasbord for aphids and crop diseases, fungal diseases, and they just whip through the plant because every plant's the same. So the only way to stop that is through massive amounts of fungicides and pesticides and slugicides and you name it, all sorts of biocides. It's unsustainable. I don't think it works. In the UK, only a third of the grain that we grow using these systems is actually fed. It's actually used direct consumption by humans. About 700,000 hectares, so just under 1 million hectares. It's a lot of grain that we produce, but 60% of the grain we produce is fed to animals. Well, so, I've had farmers tell me, well, we don't have a choice. We have to feed the world. British farmers have said that. Well, British farmers are not feeding the world. I can tell you that. They're feeding mostly animals. And it's still kind of an empty argument to me because, well, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're all going to starve. And in fact, with climate change, I suppose the result will be poorer countries who can't afford to import or don't even control their own land in many cases will be the first to start to starve. whereas a rich country like the UK will be able to import. I was in Canada just last week and speaking to a few people from British Columbia, and the Canadian wheat crop failed last year because of climate issues, and that's becoming more and more common. But tell the people in British Columbia who last summer had 50-degree heat, which withered all the crops. Last week when I left, it was 50 below zero. Now this is supposed to be the mild bit of Canada, and in between they had massive floods, which because they've clear cut the forests and the rivers are full of sludge now. Tell them that there is no, they can't, that the only alternative is to keep doing what we're doing. Well, I don't think that's necessary. I think we have to stop converting oil into grain, which is effectively what we're doing. When you create a new variety, it doesn't magically increase its yield. It's only possible if you have those massive inputs to come together. So I think there's another way. The next slide, I press that button, don't I? So the way that the alternative so far has been organic farming. Well, obviously, that's great. It's the best way we've had to grow crops without chemicals. That's fine. But in my view, and I think in the long view and in the ecological view, and I'm not trying to have a go at organic farming, as I say, because I consider myself to be an organic farmer, and organic farmers have been extremely dedicated in trying to produce the best quality food they can. But in my view, it pretty much accepts a classical kind of high input perspective on what farming is. Instead of using chemicals, we have to, an organic farmer strives to kind of increase nitrogen in a natural way. Now, we talk about natural soil fertility, restoring the natural fertility of the soil. Well, from an ecological perspective, there isn't an ecosystem in nature that has naturally high nitrogen. Nitrogen leaches out of the soil. It's always complexed with organic matter. So the whole point about organic farming is that you build organic matter into the soil. So in terms of grain, organic farmers will grow 3 years of clover grass lay. The clover fixes nitrogen. After 3 years, I'm speaking very generally, there are different rotations, but the average rotation, from what I can tell in the UK for growing grain, is 3 years of, let's say, of clover grass lay, which fixes lots of nitrogen. After 3 years, that's plowed down so that organic matter breaks down slowly, releases nitrogen. Then farmers who are growing grain will grow 1 year of wheat, hopefully a milling wheat, because that's what I'm talking about, wheat for human consumption. They'll grow a modern hybrid, usually a very modern monoculture of wheat. And then all that nitrogen that's been accumulated for 3 years and breaks down gets sucked up into that milling crop. And then the second year, well, people don't like to grow a second wheat. They will sometimes as animal feed, but the nitrogen's gone. So they'll never make it the grade for modern milling wheat, or they'll grow barley or rye or something else. But so basically every 5 years, an organic farmer will get 1 crop of wheat. And that works out to be about, if you're lucky, 2 tons an acre, or I'm still in acres. I get confused with but I wrote the figures down, 4.5 to 5 tons per hectare. Now that's fairly low compared to a conventional farm. Conventional chemical farming, and if I talk about over a 5-year rotation, an organic farm will get, let's say, 2 tons, or 1.8 tons is even 1.6, but they'll tell you they get 1.8 or 2. So that's 5 tons per hectare for an organic farm, and a conventional chemical farm will be producing 30 tons. Now that's a sixth of the yield of a chemical farm. You can see why people are saying, oh, we need the chemical farming. It clearly produces tons of grain. But that system isn't possible. We can't keep doing that. So we have to find a way of tweaking organic farming to increase the yield, in my view. Right now in the UK, thereabouts, I've got 2018 figures from DEVRA, the UK only grows 40,000 hectares of organic wheat. That's going to feed, and a quarter of that is used for direct human consumption as bread, kind of bread products, the main product. That's 10,000 hectares. That's all we grow in the UK. Most of our organic grain and flour is imported. And then you're just outsourcing all of the ecological problems and fossil fuel problems to another country, to Canada, to France, to somewhere else. I think we should be growing all the grain we can in the UK, and I think that's possible. So what we grow today is enough to feed the UK for less than a week. It's a very, very small amount. And I think the main problem has been this issue of rotation. The idea that we're fixated upon nitrogen, that the only way to grow a decent crop of grain is to have high nitrogen, and you can't grow wheat in the same field every year. And I think those are two, I won't say they're myths, they make sense if you're growing a modern variety, but I think there's a better way of doing that. We have to make organic farming more productive. I'm going to, well, you know, organic farming, just to lead into what I was going to say. Sorry, no, I'll say this, that if we need about 1 million hectares of grain to feed the UK bread, forget the animal section just for now. But to do that, we need 3 million hectares of clover grass lay. So you need 3 acres of this clover grass, at least, to grow 1 acre of heritage or of grain. So if you start to add up how much lay you need to produce the grain we're producing right now, it adds up pretty quickly. So we need 1 million for human use, and then we need another roughly 2 million to feed animals. And that's going to require another 3 million acres of clover grass lay. And I'm sorry if I'm throwing figures that will confuse you all, but bear with me just for a second. And then we need another 8 million hectares of clover grass lay to grow all the other grains, rye, barley, oats that we grow. So my point is, you need a massive amount of clover grass lay to produce the grain we're producing right now, because we're producing 60% to feed to animals. So right now we need, if tomorrow we had to grow all of our grain in the UK organically, we would need something like 13 million hectares of clover grass lay. Well, we just don't have that. We'd have to chop down the trees and our nature reserves and everything else just to grow the clover that will build up the soil nitrogen to grow the modern varieties organically. It's just not possible. So that's why I think the organic system, as wonderful as it is, it's great for animals, better animal welfare, better quality food, better tasting cheese and milk, all of that. And I don't want to really get into the debate about animals, but I do eat animal products, and I think they're delicious, and I think they're part of a good food system, as I'm sure Colin would agree. But my point is, organic to me in the future is about growing animals, and historically that's what it was. That's where organic farming, it's always been a mixed farming system, you know, there isn't actually a tradition. In fact, I might just move on to the next slide before I say that. That was just to show how even a modern organic system, the point, as I said earlier, was that you need, it's an ecosystem where you eliminate weeds, you eliminate everything else to produce one crop that is highly productive, just like a conventional system. This is an organic field at ground level. And if you see in there, it's a monoculture. Yeah, this is considered one of the most productive organic fields in the UK. And I've just been talking about crop rotation and plowing. A lot of organic farmers are moving to no-till farming. But still, as I've said, the idea is that you need to plow down a clover grass lay every 3 years to increase the nitrogen to produce where we are. So I wanted to move on to say that there isn't actually in the UK a long tradition of crop rotation using legumes. That might come as a shock to people. You know, we romanticize our farming past and everything was benevolent and kind. Actually, the UK has had its, you know, in my view, the green revolution of the UK started in probably 1790 when the beginnings of industrial farming. We haven't had a benevolent agricultural system for a long time. You know, clover only began to be used in crop rotations here in about 1750, and they used it for about 100 years or a bit more, and then we moved on to chemical fertilizer, to guano imported from all over the world. So there's really only 100 years of rotation. People talk about rotation in the medieval period. Well, they didn't use legumes. They didn't use clover. Peas and beans were grown in garden plots. The medieval rotation is winter cereal, spring cereal, and a fallow crop, but that didn't have legumes on it. And all that straw was taken off. So there was very little nutrients coming into that system, a bit from fallout, a bit of breakdown of roots. But basically, it's raiding the soil. So I never advocate, an article recently was written saying that I've become a medieval farmer and I want to wear a smock and return to medieval farming methods. Well, I mean, elements of it, some of those crops are interesting and useful, but I certainly don't want to cut a medieval field using a sickle. And it was a very, very low nitrogen system that wasn't particularly productive. These are just some images that romanticize our agricultural past. If we reduce the amount of animals we have by 50%, the amount of grain we feed to animals by about 50%, then we can just about make it. We'd still need according to my calculations, and I may be a little bit off, but we'd still need about 8 million hectares of clover grass land to produce all the grain we need organically. That's still a massive amount. That's 7 times what we have today. If we don't reduce the amount of grain we feed to animals, we'd have to produce 12 times the amount of clover grass land that we have today. So that system doesn't work. So how do we make it better? Well, to me, and I've been looking at this for a long time, it's just my approach. I don't claim to have a system that fits for everyone, but I think having spent 25 years researching various elements of grain production, and in the last 10 years, I've been fairly practical and experimenting with heritage grain crops and continuous cropping on a number of different farms, I've found an approach that I think works, but it'll have to be worked out, obviously, by every farmer using the conditions, the soil, the equipment they have. But I have an approach that I think works, which I've called restorative continuous grain cropping. And I suppose it was inspired in many ways by reading people like Fukuoka, Colin, all sorts of people I've read and tried to bring this all together. My challenge was how to adapt something. A lot of people know about Fukuoka's work on natural farming, but how do you adapt that to the UK conditions? Like I said earlier, we have the first industrialized food system. We have a massively centralized food economy. We have clearly dominated by the market. We don't have subsistence farming. We've lost all our ancient crops, all of our traditional seeds. They're all locked up in gene banks, and that's only a tiny fraction of what we once had. There are so many conditions that are different, and to make this grain revolution work in the UK is a challenge, and the biggest challenge is probably the market. We have a session on tomorrow talking about those challenges. So, but fundamentally, what counts, I think, is that we have to mimic nature, as I said at the beginning, agroecology. And so what I call a restorative continuous grain production system using heritage grains has 2 components. One is the seed, and the other is the growing system itself. So the key, and I should try to go faster. How am I doing time-wise? I'm running out of time already. Am I, Marina?
Well, you keep it shorter.
Okay. Well, we need massive genetic diversity to have a resilient crop. Diversity is the basis of resilience in a crop. Every plant in the field is a little bit different genetically. It reacts to environment in a different way. And that's the key to having a stable ecosystem, is diversity. And not just diversity within the crop, but obviously within the field as well. And we don't have a lot of that in our gene banks, so we have to go, I think, around the world to pull in all the genetic diversity we can to rebuild these diverse populations of our ancestors. And the way it works in this system, from what I can tell, is you need very tall crops that can outcompete weeds. And remember, 70–80% of the energy that produces the grain is captured by the very top flag leaf and stem and ear of a wheat plant. So what happens down below is almost architectural and structural. What counts is what happens up near the ear. And as long as those ears have popped out above the weed canopy, you're going to be all right. As long as you have deep root systems. And if you have a tall plant, you have a deep root system. They come together. When plant breeders dwarfed all of our wheats by introducing these dwarfing genes, that shortened the stem, but it also massively shortened the root system. So they can't get moisture from deep below. And that's a huge problem in a period of climate change, obviously. And also these old varieties are very good at forming connections with root fungi, mycorrhiza. So if you have a healthy, low input field, you aren't going to have so much crop disease. And that genetic diversity is the barrier to crop diseases. My fields probably have every disease in the universe in the field, but they're all at a very, very low level, just like in our own bodies. You know, we're all carrying all sorts of viruses and bacteria in us, but it's kept in check by having a healthy system. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So they're very tall. The fellow on the right, David Wilson, is 6'3". I hope he's watching. 6'3", and he's reaching up to a rye plant that is almost pushing 7 foot tall. And this crop did not fall over, did not lodge. These stems tend to blow in the wind, and they keep growing, and they produce a reasonable crop. And the one on the left is from a drought from a couple of years ago, and I'll let you guess which bundle comes from a heritage grain population, which from a modern variety called Skyfall. In the middle of the drought, basically stopped growing and produced lots of flinty little grains, the one on the left, and mine was still green and growing because it has a massively deep root system. Now it produces lots of straw, but clearly it's producing a lot less yield. But I don't mind that. To make my system work for the market that I have at the moment, all I need is about a ton an acre, 1.2. Well, obviously modern varieties, pumped full of inputs, will give you 3, 4, 5 record-breaking yields. But that doesn't mean the farmer is getting more money in his pocket. And as I say, that's at the expense of the ecosystem. So moving on to the growing system, well, what I want to do is create a grain production system that's ecologically stable and sustainable. So obviously I need to mimic a wild grass ecosystem. I want to rewild the wheat field. That's what everyone talks about, rewilding, but I think we can rewild our cereal fields actually and make them far more stable. And the background that everyone's thinking is, well, how can you feed the world on 1 ton an acre or 1.2 tons an acre? And I'll come to that. So that's the whole point of this system. So in this case, we're harvesting the grain. You'll notice we're leaving a very tall stubble. Well, actually, this is quite a unique crop that maybe I should mention. It's basically a field of weeds. It was terrible soil, Oxford brash soil in West Oxfordshire. Nothing grew in this field for years. Yellow rattle, all sorts of problems with this soil. And the owner wanted a wheat crop, so we literally broadcast heritage wheat seed population onto the surface of the soil. And then we mowed the weeds and walked away. We closed the gate, came back, and harvested 650, 700 kilos of grain per acre. Well, that's not bad for zero input, almost no fossil fuel use. And that was only year 1. This is the harvest of that crop. So it's a little bit shorter than I want it to be. But we also undersowed, with a little bit of white clover. So that was fixing nitrogen. So this year, we've resown into this field. So what we did here, so this is the harvest, high on the stem. The only thing that comes off this field is the grain. All the organic matter stays in the field, breaks down, slowly releases nitrogen to the roots and to the plant underneath, to the roots underneath, and feeds that ecosystem. So I'm expecting this year to get 1.1 tons an acre. So what we did was we broadcast into that field, and then we mowed it. This is my approach to drilling. I mean, you could have direct drilled that. You could have, instead of broadcasting. So all I do here is I mow the weeds, the clover, the stubble, the organic matter, and that just creates a lovely warm duvet over the seeds that you've just drilled or broadcast into the field. Now, most farmers would look at this and say, well, that's not how I plant my wheat seeds, but it works here. And it comes up and it grows really well. As I say, different farmers have different approaches. Not everyone has a direct drill, although that's now the main way I think people are doing things. But broadcasting does work. I think sometimes it's important to, as I say, so you broadcast into the tall weeds or stubble that you have, you grow a crop of grain, harvest that high on the stem, and then, but what I should have done probably in the spring is if you mow it a second time, it gives the wheat plants a little bit more sunshine so they can tiller, produce more stems, more ears, and that increases the yield of the crop. But other than that, you just close the gate, come back and harvest it. So I don't know of a less fossil fuel intensive way of growing grain that I can think of. And as I say, I'm consistently getting anywhere from 1 to 1.2, 1.3 tons an acre. It works. I've cut this a bit more meticulously for doing my measurements. That's the white clover at the bottom and a tall crop, in this case, of a mixture of emmer and spelt wheat growing. But you can see the idea that you have a constant green base, fixing nitrogen, growing, and you can't see many flowers, but I can tell you that the birds and the bees love these fields. It's hugely supportive of biodiversity, and it's constantly feeding that soil with live roots, with living sugars, with exudates from the plants. Remember, 30% of the carbon taken in by a wheat crop is pumped into the soil to feed the soil biology, in sugars and proteins to draw in soil microorganisms and to support mycorrhiza. So anyway, so it's a fantastic way of supporting biodiversity both above and below ground. So you have to embrace your weeds. I think that's one of the key aspects of this system, and stop tilling. And also, as you'll see, as you may have noticed, I haven't mentioned manure at all. I keep the animals off these fields. I don't want them to graze the fields because they take away carbon. They take away nitrogen. They move it off and they drop their manure somewhere else. I don't need manure in this system. I've done all the calculations on nitrogen. I won't go into huge detail here, but basically, you have nitrogen falling out from the sky, you've got the breakdown of crop material, and of course the white clover and soil microorganisms, and it adds up to 4 or 5 times the nitrogen that I actually need to grow a crop of grain that's about 1.2 tons. I'm building nitrogen in this system without any animals being involved. So for people who are into veganic farming, that's fantastic. But for farmers, for example, who don't have the infrastructure for animals, who don't have the barns, who don't want to keep animals for whatever reason, this system works. They can still grow lots of grain using a broadly organic system without at a much lower cost. So, and as I say, we're sequestering massive amounts of carbon. It's doing everything I think it needs. This is Henry Astor, who's speaking tomorrow with us on Heritage Grains in West Oxfordshire, walking through this field, which I think he was kind of shaking his head, shocked that it even grew, given that we broadcast seed onto the surface of the field and then just mowed it. But it did come up as a fairly uniform sort. I was a bit surprised at how well it did as well, given the soil. But it works. It works if you accept that lower yield. And as I say, that's what I think we need for sustainability, is a low input system with crops that are adapted to these low nitrogen situations. So I want nitrogen efficiency as nature is, as happens in nature, and as our earliest crops were like. I've experimented, I just realized I can change the slides that way, in my allotment gardens and spots with different ways of doing this with clover underneath. And my conclusion is, for a crop like wheat, small grained Eurasian cereals, growing it in strips like this doesn't really work because of the competition between the green strip of grass and clover, and grass tends to dominate over time. And I have grown strips of cereal in between. It's great for something like maize, for corn and other things. I think it's the great, and this is really an ancient Chinese system of growing cereals that has been done for thousands of years in other places. But I think when you go to grow cereals in that way on a broad scale, it doesn't tend to work. There are a lot of claims being made. I think there are different approaches. I mean, my view is let 1,000 flowers bloom, but or whatever the saying is. But I think there is a claim that you can sequester massive amounts of carbon by drilling cereals into pasture. Well, I like the idea of pasture cropping, but you have intense competition. Wheat is simply a grass, And the yield of a field like this, well, obviously it wasn't even harvested, but it can't sequester the carbon and produce the grain and also be available for grazing. If you put wheat and cows in the same field, you know what the wheat are going to eat. So, but it's going to take working out in different ways, but I think that's the approach we need. But just to emphasize in this slide the amount of carbon that is being sequestered by these ancient these rye crops. I mean, the amount of straw that is produced is enormous. And if that stays on the field, you're really sequestering lots of carbon. But there's so much that we could probably afford to take a little bit off sometimes. But it also then breaks down very quickly. So does it work? Yes, it makes fantastic bread in the hands of excellent bakers like Kate in Oxford. Wonderful sourdough loaves. And people say, well, it doesn't work. It's old varieties. They don't have the gluten. They don't have the right Hagberg numbers. Oh, they do. Old varieties can have very high protein, but lower yield. So they produce really good quality, flavorful bread that clearly works. I can tell you they work very well for spirits. I think Colin could support me on this. The bourbon corn I grew, but also the rye in particular is making wonderful products. That's not just a plug. And I don't want to just grow grain to make alcohol for people. But in the market situation, in the economic world that we are in the UK, where there are very few small grain producers, most land is owned by large farms. The minimum size to justify growing grain for human consumption is about 1,000 or 2,000 acres. You have to work within the system. And the distillers and increasingly the brewers are very keen to get this grain and will pay a premium to me to grow it. And that's how I've managed to keep my research going and to pay my bills. So beer and alcohol, beer you could argue is just liquid soup, a proteinaceous soup. Colin, I hope you'll agree there. But anyway, so it works. So how much time do I have left, Marina? I just want to race through a few terminology things.
Probably 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay,
Yep.
I'm going to go much more quickly now. So really the point of this, what is a heritage grain? But I hope you'll see that some of that is answered by what I've already said. So I think there's been a lot of confusion in this whole heritage grain sector. And I have a view that I will share, which I'd like to think is based a little bit more in an understanding of the genetics and evolution. So first of all, when people talk about genetic diversity, well, I won't go in details. A lot of people will know far more than me about DNA and genes and alleles and how that works. I studied genetics in the early 80s. I think they had hardly even discovered DNA. It's so long ago. But basically, there are different, in a wild population, like a wild grasses or maize or anything, genes differ, and genes on chromosomes, and these things get shuffled, and you have mutations and recombinations, and you get variation. Genetic variation leads to variations in how the plant grows and how it functions physiologically, how it adapts to nature. So I thought this was a good example just to show, the color difference is all based on the genetics, but that's just the surface. The real difference is what happens physiologically and structurally within the plant. And most characteristics of a crop, like wheat, whether you're talking about leaf size, stem height, grain number, they're multi-gene traits. So it's not just a little tiny mutation in one gene. That can be catastrophic or very positive, mostly catastrophic. But these products are the result of lots of genes working together. So it's a very complex system. This corn is, by the way, I spent 7 years breeding a population that's adapted to UK conditions to make some wonderful bourbon and semolina and polenta, soon hopefully to be on the market. And I was selecting every year for early ripening corn because it's quite difficult in the UK. I suppose given climate change, we'll be able to grow maize here in 10 years, no problem. Maize cross-pollinates. So does rye. I think there's been a lot of confusion about that as well. And I will make a clear statement about wheat. Wheat doesn't cross-pollinate. It has in the past, in hot weather. It's part of the wheat's evolution is that it crossed with grasses. But by and large, wheat does not cross-pollinate. So creating a mixed population, it's different than what happens with rye. Rye, the pollen blows around in the wind. and you get a lot of genetic diversity and shuffling of genes, and you can very quickly develop a genetically diverse population. In modern varieties, they cross more. In very hot weather, in Alberta, in the summer, with a very modern variety where the flowers open a bit longer, you can get a little bit of crossing, maybe 1%. But by and large, in old varieties, in medieval fields, certainly you didn't get crossing. And I've grown wheat for 25 years, old varieties of wheat. And I can say, and perhaps I just didn't have the right glasses on, but I have never really found a natural cross that's happened in my fields. Other people seem to see crosses everywhere, but I think that's got a lot to do with phenotypic expression of that variation. So just the way the genes are being expressed, not really crossing. And that's important, because if you're going to develop a population, a land race, people talk about growing a modern variety in a field for 5 years and it becomes a land race. Or some pure line variety, if you grow it long enough in one spot, it'll become a genetically diverse population. Well, I don't think that happens. I think for wheat, you have to start with 500 varieties, and a crop adapts by those lines that are best adapted to those conditions producing more seed. It doesn't just by growing it there, it doesn't mean it adapts. It's not like me moving to a warm climate and learning to live with the heat. It's actually about differential reproduction. It's about evolution. As I say, it's different with a genetically diverse, a cross-pollinating crop. So I've only got a couple left, Marina. Don't get too, bear with me. So a land race is a term that a lot of people talk about. Well, maybe I should say the word population. The word population is a much abused term. It just means a mixture of genetic lines being grown. Could be a modern population, an ancient population, whatever. That's just a group of things that are growing together. A land race, in my definition, and I think classically, is a mixed population, of an ancient mixed population that is very genetically diverse. Like I say, it could be an open pollinating one or a self-pollinating one, but that has been growing in one area, geographically circumscribed area, for many, many generations. Those are the traditional crops of our ancestors, and still many parts of the world, hopefully some people listening. And in the UK, almost no land races have survived. There's a couple of pockets of things be grown, barley and maybe some rye growing up in Uist and in the islands in Scotland. But basically, we lost all of our land races by the mid-1850s. The only evidence I know of ancient English wheat land races is what I found in ancient thatched roofs over 20 years ago. That's a rye on the bottom left falling out of the bottom layer of this roof above it. And then you see on the bottom right, that's a grain from a wheat from 1450. Now, I wish I could grow it. And we're just starting to play with the DNA that maybe we can do something to analyze it. But you can see there's very good preservation. So I know what a traditional English land race looks like. And these are populations that were grown on one manor in one valley in one region for many, many, many generations. And as long as you keep the seed and resow it from year to year, you're encouraging those lines that are best adapted to those local growing conditions. That's a land race. It takes a long time to develop. So just growing red lammas or blue cone or any other variety in a field for 5 or even 10 years does not turn it into a land race, because wheat doesn't cross-pollinate. So a population, just a mixture of things. This is a population of barley varieties, which I've put together. It includes bare barley, which is a land race. Well, I think it's a land race. Not much work has been done on looking at the genetic diversity in these old varieties we have and old heritage lines. But we had a wonderful barley mowing event. So this is, to me, a population of varieties. Variety, or cultivar, same word, is really just a genetic line that's been selected, that's pure. So this is a mixture of pure lines, pure varieties grown as a population. In 50 years, it may well evolve into a land race. Maybe that's, I don't know what the cutoff time is, but it's a long time. It takes a long time for a crop to adapt. I'd argue that maybe my rye population which has been grown for 20, 25 years and is very genetically diverse and has been adapting to local conditions for a long time, is probably getting close to being a landrace. Maybe I'd let that in, but my definition is perhaps more classical, and it takes a long, long time. You can also have a hybrid variety, of course, and that so you can take two pure line varieties, two distinctive varieties, physically cross them, and historically people then selected to get more pure lines from that. So you have hybrid varieties, or you can have an old variety. And that brings me on to something I think is important to define, which is a composite cross population. A lot of people listening to this will be familiar with a mixed population called YQ, yield times quality, which our friend Martin Wolf, who sadly isn't with us, but was an inspiration to so many of us, which he worked on along with the ORC. They took that's 19, 20 modern elite hybrid varieties and crossed them together to create this swarm of diversity. And it is wonderful research, and it's broken through the kind of the thinking and the legislation on seed legislation in the UK. And the argument was, in diversity there is strength, there is resilience, and there's no doubt that YQ and a mixed population like that is more resilient, stable, reliable yields, more reliable quality than modern varieties, particularly in a period of massive climate fluctuation. And that's fantastic. And I worked a bit with Martin on mixing older heritage populations with YQ. And clearly, in a high, the parents were elite varieties that were adapted to conventional farming or to a high nitrogen organic system. I want low input farming. So I want to create composite cross populations that have a much broader range of a much larger gene pool. Because they were elite varieties, a lot of those parents shared their genetic ancestry. So there was a very small gene pool. By shuffling that gene pool and saving all the ones in between, you're definitely increasing genetic diversity within that gene pool, but within the limits of what the parents had. And there's no doubt that crops adapted to growing in organic situations. So it's a fantastic way forward. It's a wonderful step on the path to creating more genetically diverse composite crop populations that are adapted to low input systems. So I think I would never knock the advantages of YQ, and it's becoming very popular, and it's a great non-commodity type of grain, and there's some excellent bakers like Kimberly Bell and others who are using it, and that's fantastic because we need to decentralize the grain chain, and that's one population that works for organic farmers. But again, I think that it's a population that's largely adapted to a higher nitrogen situation. It will produce well in those conditions, but doesn't produce so well in a very low input situation. I won't even talk about heirloom varieties. People talk about that in America. Anyone listening will know heirloom varieties. To me, an heirloom is something you pass down. That could be modern, that could be old. Doesn't really tell me much. That was a term that was used when I first started all this work 25 years ago. And also people talk about ancient grains. That really drives me a little bit mad. Coming back from Canada, ancient grains. Well, what's an ancient grain? What's an ancient person? It's, to me, that term doesn't really mean much at all. I mean, most of the spelt flour being sold on shelves in the UK is not from ancient forms of spelt untouched by human breeding as nature provided, the wonderful greenwash on websites about that. Most of the spelt is actually from a variety called Zollern spelt, which is crossed with bread wheat intensively. The gluten in it is bread wheat. It's really a bread wheat disguised as spelt. So, but it's called an ancient grain. You could say the same with kamut, which is, it's a modern varietal selection of a variety that, or of a species or a subspecies of wheat that was grown thousands of years ago. True, but it's not really an ancient grain. It wasn't found in the ancient Egyptian tombs either, as the first publicity said. So people talk about quinoa and buckwheat. I mean, grains like that also as ancient grains. I think ancient is just a marketing term. I don't really know what ancient is. There's even GM einkorn wheat, the first wheat ever grown by humans. So beware of that. I mean, it might be einkorn, but it's a genetically modified einkorn. Is that an ancient grain? So I think we have to be really careful. So to me, heritage grains are, which is really, I suppose, the whole point of this, but I hope you've picked up my views, is to me, it's a genetic line, a variety that is directly connected to the ancestral land races grown hundreds of years ago. So a variety like this one is blue cone, a rivet wheat, Triticum turgidum wheat, which is amazing, incredibly high yielding, disease resistant, never falls over, doesn't make the fluffiest white bread, but we don't really need that for artisan baking. We want some texture, but the texture comes from the baking process. So as far as I know, the first person I remember hearing talking about the word heritage grains, as opposed to heirloom or ancient, was a Canadian colleague named Sharon Rempel, who in the early mid 90s was using the term heritage, but wasn't talking about it in a genetic sense, just meaning it's an old cultural thing. So I started to use it in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I set up a company in 2006 called Heritage Harvest. And I thought it was a useful term because I wanted to pin down this idea of genetic diversity, because genetic diversity is the key to resilience. And I wanted to recreate those English medieval land races like the ones I found in the thatched roofs. I wanted a term that referred to genetic diversity. And to me, the huge disconnect in the genetics of the British crops happened around 1900. Now, we started losing our diversity throughout the whole 1800s. By 1850, we were growing monocultures. By 1870, we had intensive monocultural agriculture in the UK with lots of fertilizers. And, is it really quantitatively different for what's happening in the 1930s? Well, it is in the sense that from 1900, people started hybridizing wheats. So the varieties released after 1906, the first hybrid variety was Victor, released in 1906. After that, you have intensely uniform, genetically uniform varieties. Before that, you've got uniform lines that still have a connection to their ancestors. And there's still probably a little bit of diversity within those older heritage lines. So to me, it's not about the Green Revolution, because wheats from we didn't actually start using dwarfing genes like the Green Revolution varieties until the 1980s in the UK. So a wheat from 1990 is no different from a wheat from 1920. They're all monocultures. Yes, they're a little bit taller, but just saying a heritage line is tall doesn't really mean much, because that depends on how much nitrogen you use. So those are all vague terms. I think we have to link heritage to genetic diversity, because our goal here is resilient crops that are productive, also productive. So that's how I use the term. So heritage grains, to me, are varieties from before roughly 1900, when people started to hybridize. And I still think it's the most useful meaning that I can see. All those other words are just too vague. So, and the key is these old varieties have, as I keep saying, tall stems, very deep root systems, good quality gluten. They're very nutritious because I think they have these very deep root systems, and they don't have some of the problematic gluten that modern varieties have. So I think they can be much healthier for people. Also depends on how you bake them. And so my goal is not just to grow pure line varieties, but to grow of heritage varieties. They're still monocultures. So I want, they're great, and they may have different flavors. I think you've got to be pretty astute to tell the difference between a loaf of bread made from red lammas or orange Devon blue rough chaff, or any of the hundreds of beautifully named varieties we have. Well, actually hundreds. We have very few in our gene banks, as I say. I want to recreate those medieval populations that are genetically diverse. That's the key to resilience, not just growing an old variety, but growing a mixture of old varieties. So you bring together hundreds of old varieties, because remember, they don't cross. So I'd like to bring together 10,000 varieties from all over the world, put them in one field, let them evolve for 20 years, then I'll let you call it a land race. But that crop will be locally adapted. And my money would be that it would produce about 1.2 tons an acre using clover as an understory. And we're back to where we were 500 years ago, but it works a little bit better. And what I haven't said, which I really should say, is that I said conventional farming will produce 30 tons of grain over 5 years. Organic will produce 6. But in my system, a continuous cropping system, you grow these wheats in the same field every year. And like I said, the genetic diversity, the clover, all of this means I don't have to worry about disease. I don't have to worry about nitrogen. So I get 1.2 tons every year. So over 5 years, I get 6 tons an acre. Sorry, I confused units. I still function in acres. 6 tons an acre compared to an organic farmer getting 1.8 or 2. So this continuous cropping system using heritage grains produces 3 times the grain of an organic grain system. Now that's really significant. I said what we need to do is tweak the organic system to be more productive. Well, I think this is a way forward. Of course, it gets rid of the animals, and animals are profitable. But hey, let the organic farmers grow all the animal products we need in the country for lots of reasons, but separate that from grain. And let's use a restorative continuous cropping system to grow the grain, because it's 3 times more productive than organic farming. And that brings it up to much closer within the range of what conventional farmers are producing. And that way we also don't need to cover the country in clover grass lay just to build the nitrogen so that we can grow modern varieties organically. So to summarize, I've shown this one before, but the future is in our hands. I suppose that's an obvious statement to make with that slide, but I think it's true. You know, I think that plant breeders have become less involved in narrowing the genetic heritage of the past and to create these pure line varieties that are super productive and adapted to high input systems, which is really what most plant breeders do, organic or conventional. And I think they have to become more custodians of the genetic heritage of our crops from the ancient past, or from the past. And I think that's a huge paradigm shift, because most plant breeders work for agribusiness and large grain companies. So I think that's what I want to do, is change both the way we grow these crops, again, for low input conditions, and we still just have those genetic resources available. In the West, we need to rebuild it. In many countries, developing countries in the world, hopefully people listening, that they will be already preserving what's left in their countries, what we destroyed over the past 150 years ago. So in my view, there is a way of feeding the UK, dare I say feeding the world, but feeding the UK all the grain we need. It's going to mean reducing the grain we feed to animals by at least 50% in my view, but I think that's probably healthy for us. And if we use a continuous cropping system, we won't have to plow up the whole country and plant clover grass lay everywhere. We can do it, but we have to let go of our obsession with nitrogen, obsession with high input systems. It's ironic, I suppose, that the way to the way we can feed people is to grow lower yielding crops, not higher yielding crops. So, but like I say, to me, it's about adapting the crop to the ecosystem. So I think I've pretty much said it all. I think what we need is not a new green revolution based on kind of robotics and GM crops and GPS systems and chemical farming disguised as sustainable intensification, or whatever you want to call it, regenerative farming that still uses just a little bit of glyphosate. In all of those systems, I think we need a genuine green revolution, and to me that's a heritage grain revolution in the crops, in the way we grow it, and in the whole economy that surrounds it. We need to decentralize the grain chain, and I'm sure I've gone over, and I'm really sorry, Marina, because I promised I wouldn't, but there we go. You allowed me to finish, and I'm grateful for that, and I hope that made sense to everyone, and I rest my case.
Well, thank you, John. I think I remember you said to me once, you said we're growing grains in a kind of Formula One, using the Formula One a lot of energy to grow our grains. Sometimes we should think the low input, like going to ride a bicycle, and we are able to cycle everywhere, and when it's possible, and when it's healthier and sustainable. I think that kind of analogy probably is important to remember why low input is the key to this new revolution. I would like to invite Colin to give us some kind of summary, as well as the kind of highlight a number of key terms in John's speech. In particular, for a person like me who is not having any natural science background, there's a number of terms: line races, population, genetic diversity. So if you can give us some kind of guide to help our audience to get to the essence of John's work. And then if we have some time, we will address lots of questions from the Q&A. Thank you, Colin.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
I just wanted to say that I thought John explained the main technicalities very well. So I feel I'm sort of off the hook, really. A couple of points that just strike me is that the things that have been considered to be great virtues over the last 200 years in arable farming, or indeed the things that have been considered to be great vices, have been completely reversed in this. I mean, the extent to which this is revolutionary can hardly be overstated. I mean, for example, John emphasizes above all the need for diversity. Genetic diversity translated into phenotypic diversity, how the plant actually looks and functions. Well, the last 200 years have been about narrowing, producing particularly mono lines that do well in very particular circumstances. And the last 200 years, ever since Bennett laws and Liebig developed artificial fertilizers, the emphasis has been on very, very high yields based largely on increasing use of artificial fertilizers. This is the complete reversal. We're talking about modest yields achieved with minimal inputs. The only inputs, in fact, are those provided by clover, natural nitrogen fixation. And the last 60 years in particular, about 60 years, have been one of the big efforts has been to reduce the height of wheat, because straw was considered to be a waste of energy. And if you fertilize the plant in order to get more grain, it grew too tall and fell over, in other words, lodged. And one of John's points is that these ancient varieties, if I might use the expression, tended to be very, very tall. I wish John would show that picture by Broyville, which shows all the peasants cutting the wheat, and it's over their heads. I mean, they were really little chaps. It was very, very tall wheat, very thick straw. John also makes the point, though he didn't make it today, that straw itself, if you grow decent wheat straw, is a very valuable commodity, which you can sell for quite a lot of money if you're interested in the money. But the tall ones, as he says, they outgrow the weeds. So you don't need the herbicides. What we've got overall, John used the expression paradigm shift, is a huge paradigm shift, which I think has to extend not only across arable farming, but across all agriculture, and in fact across the whole human mentality. Let's focus on arable farming. Arable farming this last 200 years has become an exercise in industrial chemistry practiced on a very large scale, now abetted by various forms of biotechnology, including genetic engineering and gene. What we need now is to enter a new age, an age of ecology, in which we genuinely understand, or try to understand, how nature itself works, and, as the expression is, work with it, rather than trying to obliterate it and replace it with a a sort of crude pastiche, which is what modern farming tends to be. So, brilliant stuff. And I look forward to hearing more and hearing John field your no doubt probing questions.
Well, thank you, Colin. We have lots of questions, more than 30. So we can't go through all the questions. I kind of categorize a number of groups of the questions. Some of them are very technical. So for example, what kind of no-till system, how you broadcast the broadcast rate, and what kind of straw, whether the long straw, the organic straw, some of the modern weeds, how we do the modern plant variety, can we grow organic and using your system? So these are the kind of technical questions. Another group is agronomy. For example, whether other countries using the similar approach, and whether we have any experience. And also, since the fertilizer is getting more expensive, and would that be an incentive for farmers to go towards this Euro system? So probably I stop here, and if there are more questions, we have time, we answer them. John.
So I've been sorry. I was reading through the really interesting questions, comments on the chat. I'm fascinated by. There are so many things I want to answer. So do we have? How much time do we have, Marina?
We have 12 minutes.
Well, can I just say, okay, I've only gotten through half of them, but I'm going to say one of the questions was, it's illegal to sow heritage grains because they're not on the national list. It's not. That's not technically true. I can't market a grain that has not been on the not been approved to be put on the national list, but that doesn't mean you can't grow it. You can get it yourself from a gene bank, and everyone has a right internationally to write by international agreement to write to a gene bank and to get seeds out. They'll only send you 25 seeds, but if you get 500 packs of 25 seeds from different places, you can create your own population and start to do it. That's all I did. It wasn't brain surgery, but well, you have to figure out which ones you want to choose, and I'm sure the gene banks will now be angry that I've mentioned that, because everyone's going to write to them, and it is challenging for them. Anyway, it's not technically illegal, but you can't give, exchange, or sell seed of a heritage grain to a third party, to anyone else, but you can use it yourself. So what I do is I just have farmers grow for me on contract. I continue to have ownership. It's all my grain, and I have 600 acres being grown, and it's really working. So to me, accessing the seed isn't the problem. Anybody who wants to bulk it up could do that. The seed legislation isn't great, and it discourages what we're doing, but it's not the legislation itself that is the block. It's the lack of a market. It's the lack of demand. It's the fact that bakers, most people using flour, are going to choose the cheapest flour they can find, to be quite honest. And I've been upset a bunch of bakers with what I've just said, but everybody has to make a living. I understand that. But in this market, it's very difficult. Another question, someone said about assimilate. What I meant by assimilate, when I said plants 30% at least of the carbon a wheat plant takes in, any plant, but wheat plant certainly, because it's a grass, is sequestered into the soil. The roots literally squish out exudates that contain sugars and all sorts of nutritious chemicals that are carbon-based and sometimes protein-based to attract soil microorganisms like mycorrhiza that then, in return for those sugars, give the plant minerals and nutrients that the plant wants. There's a symbiosis happening under the soil. That's what I meant by assimilate. Hen Gymro, someone mentioned, and this applies to other varieties, heritage varieties that people are growing in Wales. I know about Hen Gymro. I met a man who once grew it in the 1930s. I would say Hen Gymro is like other heritage varieties. Until I know better, I don't see it as being very genetically diverse. It's a heritage variety. It's old. It's not hybridized. Doesn't mean it's a landrace. But it's a great wheat to have as a component of a mixture. It was grown in the mountains in Wales. I've done a fair amount of research in Wales, but other types of wheat were grown in Glamorganshire in South Wales. They were more commercial varieties. Someone mentioned about folding animals, sheep and cattle, onto medieval fields, and that was a big contribution of nitrogen. I disagree. If you do your calculations on how much nitrogen is in manure, and it's not manure, sorry, it's feces. Remember when they didn't house animals indoors in the medieval period. The herds were tiny, first of all. They were all owned by the lord of the manor, mostly, not entirely. But they would occasionally fold the sheep and what cows and sheep there were onto the fields. They'd drop a bit of feces, but it would lie there for until they next plowed it. Any farmer will know that if you dump manure onto the soil, you have to incorporate it right away or the nitrogen evaporates. And what happens in a barn, if you mix manure with urine, that creates ammonia, which then volatilizes. So you lose most of your nitrogen, a lot of your nitrogen in manure anyway. So I don't think animals made a big contribution. And the last thing, the last thing, I'm trying to read my own writing. I'm sorry. It said that you can't call the system I'm advocating, restorative continuous grain cropping, organic. Technically, that's true, or legally, that's true. I can't be certified organic. I fit every bill on the certification. I'm actually living and working on an organic farm. I tick every box, and I've been told, quote, you tick every box in spades except one. You don't rotate. And certification is about rotation. And I understand where that comes from. But I was using the term, I suppose, in a broad sense. I've been a supporter of organic farming for 40 years. I don't use chemicals, and I believe in soil health and building everything that we believe. But you're right, my system is not technically organic because I don't rotate. And I think it's time. I would love to have a discussion with the organic sector about opening that definition of organic to include alternative views on how to grow grain organically. And I've tried to do that. I'm waiting for a response. But I think it's perhaps shocked some, about 100 years of people doing organic the way they do it, and it's carved into stone. But I think we need some new stone tablets to start carving into that expands our way of doing things. Sorry, Marina, that was only part of the questions. I hope I answered some of them.
I think you covered quite a lot. I think there are a couple of questions probably will be addressed tomorrow in the section we're going to have on the obstacle of heritage grain production and supply chain of heritage grain in the UK. So some of the questions, for example, you just mentioned about the cost for artisan bakers. And they said it's too expensive to buy heritage flour, and where can we get the flour and how we get it, and all these issues. So I will welcome everybody in this section. If you have time, you're very welcome to join us for that kind of discussion, the agronomy, all kinds of issues, infrastructure, retailing, as well as not only about growing system, which is very important, but how we're able to support the market, the economy that can sustain this new development using very, very innovative, restorative way to grow our grains. So I think probably we leave those questions for tomorrow's section. And a couple of things I would like to ask Chang and Colin before we finish the section is as an academic. So from now, what kind of things the most urgently we need to do for you for kind of research, or what kind of practice we need to advocate? We have like 3 minutes to finish the section. So what in your both of you, what is the urgent issue that you want to focus on? What is the takeaway message you want to give the audience?
I have a quick answer, but I would want to hear Colin. But one is, I think, and it's fair enough, that people want hard evidence that this system works, and I haven't been able to fund that. I don't have an academic post, and I've not been able to get research funding to prove this, but I think, so I just work on first principles. If the only thing that leaves the field is the grain, everything else is staying on the field. That's called sequestering carbon in my view, largely. So I think the figures, the scientific figures that justify, that trigger things like subsidies are important to do. And also I think that what's really important probably is that this alternative grain sector comes together and rather than fighting each other like a bad Monty Python or like a good Monty Python skit. I think we have more in common than we have to disagree with. But we need to hammer out a basic consensus about what it is we want to do with this alternative. Like what is the alternative? You know, the idea of diversity and resilience, and because we have a big battle ahead of us, given the centralized economy and centralized grain production that we have. But the advantage is, well, not the advantage. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that grain prices are rising on the global market because of crop failure. So people are saying, "Oh, I can grow more chemical wheat." You know, that's how farmers are responding. So we have to find a way of having smaller scale production, working with smaller farmers, and working together to be on the same page. You know, if you're growing heritage grains using lots of glyphosate and chemical growth regulators, that isn't the solution. That's not a heritage grain movement to me. So I think there's a lot of ground to be done there. Sorry.
Thank you. And Colin?
Well, what John's talk emphasizes for me is the extent to which it's necessary to be radical in now thinking about all agriculture, get right back to root principles and effectively start again. And we should be basing everything we do on the principles of morality, you know, what is it right to do, and the principles of ecology, what is it possible and necessary to do. And that's the exact opposite of the way modern governments and modern corporates work. They're all about the so-called bottom line, multiply, etc., etc. In particular, we have to bring the economy, which is the sort of center of everything we do, in line with ecological reality, which is now absolutely not, and restore the moral content of it, which has been swept aside by the neoliberals. And the short term or immediate term, starting now, is I think we need lots and lots of examples to demonstrate how heritage grains, or whatever you want to call it, how it actually does work and is good for people. And one of the advantages here is that another thing John didn't actually mention really is that it's possible to grow this kind of grain in this kind of ways on a small scale. So this opens up arable to the small mixed farmer, even to the smallholder, in a way that conventional arable simply doesn't. So that's it. Anyone that's interested should get stuck in. We're going to talk about the obstacles tomorrow. I'm not, but John is.
And Marina.
Well, I put my email address for those people who wants to ask any questions and your question hasn't been answered, and you're welcome to send us an email. And because we can't address all of them, so please do contact us. And I think it's a good time. Probably today is only the beginning of the journey, even though John has been working on this sector for the 20, 30 years. But this kind of new approach, new revolution is only the beginning. And we need everybody come together to find ways, common ground to move forward. So thank you very much, John and Colin and everybody here to join us, and we hope to see you soon, and probably tomorrow at another section of the heritage grain supply chain and production. And hopefully we see you soon tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. For all the
Thank you.
people I haven't said hello that I recognize their names. It's nice to see your names and hope to see you at some point.
Yeah, we keep in touch.